Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than Truth, the show that cuts through noise to get to what matters in global affairs and power politics. Today's guest is CNN anchor and bestselling author Jake Tapper, here to discuss his latest book, Race Against Terror, Chasing an Qaeda Killer at the Dawn of the Forever War, a true crime national security thriller which is arriving on October 7th. Jake, thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much.
We're excited to discuss your new book, Race Against Terror, but before we dive in, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you about your recent comments about Jimmy Kimmel, Charlie Kirk. You called Kimmel's removal from the air the most direct infringement by the government on free speech in your lifetime. That's a pretty significant statement to make. What compelled you to say that, and what do you think this means for free speech under the current administration?
Well, I mean, Trump and Vance came to office saying that they were going to stand for free speech and then they would not use the government to infringe on free speech and that they would defend the rights of those with whom they disagree. And then what the FCC commissioner did was one of the most naked violations of that I've ever seen. I mean, he went on a right-wing podcast and suggested that not only Disney, but local affiliates stop airing the Jimmy Kimmel show because of comments Kimmel made that he didn't like. And the largest owner of local affiliates in the country, Nexstar, which needs Brendan Carr right now for this major merger. They're trying to buy their largest competitor. They need not only the FCC to approve it, but the FCC to change their rules, which right now say that only, no media organization can own TV affiliates that reach more than 39% of American households. And this deal would bring it up to like 80 or something like that. So they not only need Brendan Carr's approval, they need Brendan Carr to change the rules at the FCC. Within hours after Brendan Carr saying that, Nexstar, said, that's what we're doing. And they said that they were not going to air Kimmel anymore. And then Sinclair followed soon after. And that meant like 60 TV stations, local TV affiliates, including mine here in Washington, D.C., did not air the Jimmy Kimmel show once he came back to air. So, I mean, it was just like it was the government directly saying, I don't like this speech. And local affiliates, you should do X, Y, Z to remove this speech from the airwaves. And it was pretty shocking, I thought. And I have a record on this sort of thing. When I was a White House correspondent for ABC News, the Obama White House was, and this is not the same thing, and I'm not comparing them, but the Obama White House was trying to label Fox News as not a legitimate news organization, and they tried to freeze them out of a pool rotation for an interview. And A, all the networks banded together and said, you can't do that. You can't freeze Fox out. And B, I asked the White House why it was appropriate in their view for the White House to label a credentialed news organization not a legitimate news organization. And look, I have my opinions on Fox, but that's not the point. The point is, why is it appropriate for the government to be doing that? So I just felt like this was a pretty horrific violation of that principle. And I'm glad that Disney reversed itself, and I hope that other media giants follow suit.
Well, President Trump is more emboldened now than he ever has been before. Of course, he's in his second and final term. Do you worry that this
one hopes? One hope. Well, just because one hopes that he's not going to attempt to violate the constitutional provision of only, say, 2 terms. But yes.
Yeah, well, where do we go from here? I mean, do you think that there's a world where freedom of speech and entertainers, journalists, academics can actually have freedom of speech and be listened to? Or is this the start of a very dangerous, almost Turkish-style downward spiral?
We're in the downward spiral. It's just a question of how blatant it is. Like, for example, what happened with Colbert? I mean, we all suspect we know what happened, but that was all behind the scenes. Sherry Redstone wanted this deal to go through, and the timing of the announcement of the cancellation of Colbert was very fishy. That all happened right before the FCC approved the merger. Right now, Apple TV has put on hold a show called Savant with Jessica Chastain. which has to do with her. It's based on a true story. It has to do with her character investigating hate groups. And they really gave no indication as to why they suspended the release of the show indefinitely. People think it might have something to do with the horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk or whatever. I don't know, but like we already see, I mean, as Henry II did when he said, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And then all of a sudden 4 people came and assassinated the Archbishop of Canterbury. Like sometimes it's not a direct order. It's just, "Oh, I hate this." And then all of a sudden people start following the direction that is implied. I think we are in the midst of that, and whether it continues to spiral downward or not, it depends on how the CEOs act and the pressure they feel. If they feel, I think that it's been hypothesized to me that the reason that Bob Iger reversed the Disney decision was because he was worried about his legacy. And also that he saw that there was pushback and that the financial incentives were not just one way, that they, that they were both ways. The more that, and look, I think that there should be conservative TV programming, liberal TV programming, libertarian TV program. I just think there should be a freedom for all this, and people shouldn't be worried about upsetting whoever happens to be in the Oval Office at any given moment. But I am worried about it. I didn't like when it came out the degree to which the Biden administration was pushing YouTube and Google and Twitter and others to disallow speech they didn't like, not just racist or Nazi speech, but also just speech they didn't like that didn't violate the policies of the social media organizations, like the lab leak theory during COVID. I mean, there was no reason for that to be blocked. So I fear that we're in the middle of a downward slide, but I hope not.
Yeah. So you recently, the book that you have coming out is about Al Qaeda, and I think most people understand that folks joined groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda because of desperation. And I want to sort of talk about that in relation to the murder of Charlie Kirk 2 or 3 weeks ago. The whole episode around Kimmel was because Charlie Kirk was murdered in front of the entire country. Everyone saw the videos. We are, of course, seeing a rise in political violence on the left, on the right. This goes back a while. Do you think that rise is actually rooted in just desperation? More people feeling they can't actually have a shot in America? And if so, how is our political violence different from the political violence in other parts of the world?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that in addition to violence on the left and violence on the right, and this is a little bit more complicated to talk about, but I think there's also kind of just this nihilistic violence of people who are just, and this gets into what you're talking about, the desperation, that people don't necessarily have a particular ideology per se. They're not doing this to advance the progressive cause or stop conservatives or vice versa. It's just that they don't know what to do. They have mental health struggles. They have easy access to firearms. I think that there is right now in American culture a very dangerous incentive structure built up around demonizing people. You see it; it's worse now than it's ever been in terms of just literally the incentive structure for monetization is about bad guys. And look, the Rupert Murdoch's business empire is built on the idea of like, we want people to be scared or we want them to be angry. It's about creating villains. And that is, you see that on the New York Post, you see that at Fox, et cetera. But what we're seeing on social media takes it even further. Not to blame it on Murdoch, just like the idea of bad guys. We're creating bad guys. And I see it on the left and the right. And I think that there's just a lot of misinformation and a lot of, because of the desperation you talked about, because of the isolation, because of people not connecting, it can lead to very, very ugly places and ugly things. And, it's not always just like a neat little box of, well, this person was motivated by this, I mean, that might be the case with Charlie Kirk's assassin, who it seems as though was at least based on the information we have now, in a relationship with somebody who's trans and thought that Charlie Kirk was spreading hate against the trans community. Again, I'm not justifying this as a horrific act of violence, but I'm saying like that appears to be the motive as we see it right now. But we also see other acts of violence that are not that simple. That guy who had CTE who went into the New York skyrise and tried to kill people with the NFL. And then some of the reaction online when some of the innocent victims were killed, or some of the reaction online we've seen with the assassination of the United Healthcare CEO. There's a lot of anger out there and a lot of demonization, and it's leading to some very unhealthy acts and some very unhealthy support for those acts.
Well, I, of course, want to talk about the book, but you've hit on a few things I would love to follow up on quickly, and then I want to also defer to Gerwin. But you're talking about people who are lonely, that isolated, that draws them into extremism. Candace Owens has 7.2 million followers on X right now, more than every anchor for any station, any one station in the country. I guess my question is...
Can I just interrupt for 1 second on that one point?
Yeah.
Any one of us could spread hate and ignorance and lies and match that. I mean, the code is not that difficult to break.
Right.
One of the reasons why Fox is what it is because they don't care about fairness. They are about villains. And that is a very lucrative field. Candace Owens is now doing that with the oldest scapegoats in the world, the Jews.
Yeah.
And of course, she can get millions of people to listen to that. Candace Owens can, and all the others. So it's yes, it's alarming, but it's also not a surprise. And any one of us, I mean, I'm sure, let me just pick somebody at random, like Sharon Alfonsi, who's an incredible anchor on 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
If she decided she wanted to be a hate merchant and demonize a group, whatever the group is, and talk in a, Candace has charm, let's not, and broadcasting skills, let's not take that away from her. And then, and use, if Sharon Alfonsi were to, and I'm sorry to pick on Sharon, but like, if she were to use her considerable charm and broadcasting skills to do that, she could do that. It's not a mystery that happens. So sorry, I digress.
No, you're fine. And I don't think anyone is saying that Candace Owens has a good platform, but I guess my question is, how can traditional media win back the people they've lost who are now turning towards these outlets of escapism, of extremism, of danger?
I don't know. I mean, I think that first of all, more mainstream legacy media has been slow when it comes to getting in the spaces of YouTube and podcasts and that sort of thing. And so it's that issue is one that I think bedevils a lot of people in mainstream media, legacy media. I right now, just in the last few weeks, have been trying to crack the code on social media by doing these little 3-minute explainers about various stories in the news, and doing them through CNN, which is now trying to embrace the idea of these little vertical videos.
Mm-hmm.
And we have had some success on that, but when I say some success, like maybe a few million views, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But like, we are, legacy media is an ocean liner, turning around slowly in the Panama Canal, and the others, podcasters, YouTubers, etc., are they're speedboats, and hopefully we can get there, because that's where people are. That's where viewers and listeners are, and we need to get there. And hopefully we can do so. But I mean, we also need to reestablish ourselves as truthful, honest sources of information, which has been difficult to do. And also with all the demonizing of the mainstream legacy media by Trump, by Fox, by the Democrats, et cetera. But also there have been self-inflicted wounds that we've committed on ourselves.
Yeah.
Jake, if you were given that environment, if you were starting again today, you're 22 years old, you graduated college, would you go into journalism?
Yeah, because I'm drawn to it and I'm a news junkie. And when I go on vacation, I'm constantly reading the news. But I guess another question would be, would I go in the route that I went? And I started in alternative media. I started as a freelancer, then I was at Washington City Paper, then I was at Salon.com, and I little by little ended up in mainstream media. But one of the reasons I wrote this book is because I still write quite a bit. So I guess the question is, would I, if I were starting now, would I be? This was not the goal. Where I am now was not the goal. It was not like I'm going to do A, then I'm going to do B, then I'm going to do C. It was more like I want to be a journalist, so I ended up at City Paper. And then it just went from there. What I tell young journalists is that the bread and butter of who, what, when, where, why, and how will always be the most important, and learn how to do that, learn how to write, and then you can take that skill anywhere you want to go. But would I say start at CNN as a desk assistant and then work your way up? Or would I say start your own YouTube channel? I don't know. I remember I originally wanted to be a comic strip cartoonist when I graduated from college. And I did a daily comic strip in the school paper. And when I met Gary Trudeau, who was my hero growing up, the artist behind Doonesbury, he told me, and this was years later, so I had already not succeeded as a cartoonist and was a journalist. He told me that what he tells young people is, because comic strips are, in his view, and in the view of a lot of people, kind of a dying art in America. You certainly can't be as powerful and popular and successful as you could in comic strips as you could 20, 30 years ago.
No, you got to be a meme maker now. You got to make the memes.
Well, he tells people to go into animation in Hollywood. Which, obviously there is a lot of success with animators and the like. So I don't know. I don't think that I'm at that point in journalism where Gary Trudeau was in comic strips, but certainly the world is changing.
Yeah. So look, you've written your 8th book. Congratulations, The Race Against Terror. What made you want to write this book specifically right now? And is the release date of October 7th a coincidence?
The release date of October 7th is a coincidence. It is, if we had to look for a tie-in, it is more relevant to the fact that that's the 24th anniversary of the start of the war in Afghanistan than anything else. And this book, large chunks of it take place in Afghanistan. I wanted to tell the story because I heard the story, and it was just such an incredible story, because it's just all about, I don't know how much you guys love police procedurals like I do. Like I just love Law and Order and CSI. I love sleuthing. I love the stories about how they find bad guys. True stories are even better than not true, than fiction. So I was at my son's 13th birthday party. He wanted a paintball party, so we went out to rural Virginia, like an hour outside of DC, and the kids were all paintballing. And I'd done this before, so I know that like it's such a haul for the grown-ups that I just have pizza and drinks for the grown-ups too, so they can just chill out for a couple hours and they don't have to spend 4 hours in a car. They can just spend 2. And anyway, one of the dads comes up to me and says, I know Dave Roller from The Outpost. The Outpost was a book I wrote about Afghanistan that came out 13 years ago. I know Dave Roller from The Outpost. And I said, that book, that was a true story about an outpost in Afghanistan that was intact by like 300, 400 Taliban one day, and 8 American soldiers were killed, and all the rest. True story. Anyway, I said that story was really difficult for me to write because the military keeps such crappy records, and they're really reluctant to share any of them. And the dad, Dave Bitcower, said, "Tell me about it." And he starts telling me this story about a case he worked on, where he was at the Eastern District of New York, an assistant U.S. attorney in Brooklyn, and he gets a call from the FBI. The Italians, during the Arab Spring, had commandeered a cruise ship, and they just had a whole ship full of refugees. And one guy asked a guard for some water, and the guard noticed he had a bullet wound. And how'd you get the bullet wound? I was fighting Americans in Afghanistan. I'm with Al-Qaeda. They take him into custody. They interrogate him. And they call the Americans, and they're like, "Have you heard of this guy? He says his name is Spin Ghoul, and he's killed Americans." And they'd heard of him. He'd gone off the radar for a few years, but they had heard of him. And so the long story short is the Americans have a very short period of time to prove a case against Spin Ghoul, so they can lock him up forever, or the Italians are going to stick him in a refugee camp and he'll escape and, slaughter as many Americans as possible. So the sleuthing of the story, he just starts to tell me about the sleuthing. And then we found this, and then we found that. And then there was this fingerprint and that fingerprint. And just like all these things were just, and I was at the edge of my seat. And then when he was done, I'm like, has anyone told this story before? Has this been told? He said, no, people covered when he was prosecuted, because they did ultimately get him to the United States for prosecution. And he was the first foreign terrorist ever prosecuted in a U.S. criminal court for killing American service members on a battlefield. It never happened before. Anyway, I was just like, wow. And, a week later, I was taking him and his colleague out to lunch, and I just thought it was this riveting story. But the question of why not just send him to Gitmo, why not just send him to a military commission, why go through all this time and expense of investigating and trying him? That's, a lot of people asked that while it was going on. I mean, I could look at it and say, well, because they did all that, Spin Ghoul, spoiler alert, is in prison for the rest of his life. And if they had just sent him to Gitmo, if it had been a few years earlier and Bush had been president, and if they had just sent him to Gitmo, honestly, they wouldn't have accumulated all the evidence, and he probably would have been freed by now. They probably just would have been like, well, he's been in a Gitmo for 10 years now, and we don't really have a case against him, and maybe just like release him. And they would send him back to Niger, where his ethnicity is from, where his parents were from, or Saudi Arabia or whatever. And I don't doubt for one second that he would have like, okay, great, now I can get back in the terrorism game. And he would have tried to, he was trying to repeat after killing Americans on the battlefield, he wanted more. He wanted to repeat the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings, except he wanted to do it in Nigeria. So this was a serial mass killer to be, and the Americans did it in a way to lock him up forever. And what's interesting is now, I think unknowingly, Trump is following in Obama's footsteps, because they are prosecuting this guy who was one of the guys who conspired to do the Abbey Gate bombing in 2021 in Afghanistan. His name's Jafar. He'll be the second foreign terrorist tried in a criminal court for killing Americans on a battlefield or in a war zone. And I'm sure Trump has no idea he's following in Obama's footsteps, but he is. And I think it's actually smarter and safer, because Jafar will end up, in all likelihood, locked away forever instead of freed in 10 years. And who knows what he would do.
So that's actually a really astute observation, because this was a big debate like almost 20 years ago between Gitmo and putting people through criminal court. And so
huge.
Obviously, at the time, people were like, well, obviously putting people in Gitmo is going to be safer for us. We're saying actually following through on our values of prosecuting these folks actually was keeping us safer.
That's what the data shows. First of all, you go back and a lot of this is in the book, but like there was this fear of bringing terrorists to the United States for prosecution. People talked about the terrorists as if they were like Thanos, that there were these supervillains who were going to like burst out of prison, and like lightning was going to shoot from their fingers, and they were going to be able to kill everybody. Which was, I mean, like, honestly, it's kind of indicative of how terrorized people still were 10 years after 9/11. And it wasn't just Republicans, it was Democrats too. Nobody wanted these guys brought to the States. But in terms of military commissions versus criminal trials, there have been like more than 600 terrorists have been prosecuted in criminal courts now since 9/11, and almost all of them have been found guilty. And when it comes to military commissions, I think there have been two cases, and one of them was partially thrown out of court.
You were talking about how, I actually remember this. I lived next to a Supermax prison when I was in elementary school.
It's crazy.
Middle school, really? Where?
Wisconsin. Wisconsin.
Hey, Wisconsin.
You were elementary school by a Supermax prison?
To be clear, it was like a mile away, but I would walk past it because I walked both ways.
But that's scary.
But people were scared. People were like, if you bring terrorists and put them in Supermax prisons, they're going to get out and blow people up. It's like, what the fuck are you guys talking about?
The Supermax in Florence, right? Yeah. The Supermax in Florence is like Con Air. It's just like the worst of the worst. That's where Spin Ghoul is right now.
Yeah.
With a ton of terrorists, foreign and domestic. And, Yeah, I can understand. I mean, like, I wouldn't want to go to elementary school a mile away from it. I agree with that. But I'm also not afraid. I'm not afraid of them busting out. I think I don't know what's going on with my lighting.
Oh, you're
fine.
Okay. So I think there it is. That's perfect. How do you think, Jake? How do you think the war on terror changed America? Because when 9/11 happened, Nathan and I were still, he's going to elementary school next to a supermax prison. When it happened,
they were teaching. It's just weird that they had the serial killers come in to substitute teach. I mean, that was the only odd thing.
Public school in America is cheap, man.
Here's Ed Gein coming in to teach you math today. All right, sorry.
Well, never mind. I had a side story, but we don't have that much time. So go ahead, Gerwin.
But I mean, how do you think we changed? I mean, we've heard obviously from folks how it's changed, but you, as an observer of history, as an observer of our country, how do you think we changed as a result on the war on terror in 9/11?
I think there have been a few different inflection points. I think, first of all, there was like a good 10 years of just raw terror. Yeah. 5 to 10, right? Of just like people were just absolutely terrified. But somewhere in there, people and some people were always there, but the what were perceived as excesses by the Bush administration. And let's assume for the benefit, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and think like, okay, like what Bush and Cheney were doing, they really thought like we have to keep the American people safe. This was a huge breach. We have to come face to face with this terrorist threat, et cetera, et cetera. But what the decisions that were made in terms of enhanced interrogation and extraordinary rendition and declaring people enemy combatants, all of that, I think there are questions today about whether that made us safer ultimately. I mean, we all know that Gitmo was used as a recruiting tool and the like. And then there's also just the question of we want to make sure that in the way that the U.S. combats and fights the war on terror, that we're not creating more terrorists than we're killing, right? So I think there are like all sorts of sophisticated questions about all of that. I think that where we are now is kind of in a consensus view that is neither Bush nor Obama, that is kind of just like in this middle ground. Obviously, there is more of an eagerness to kill terrorists abroad with drone warfare or whatever. But, Obama upped drone warfare from what Bush was doing, like 100-fold. So I think we're kind of for all of Trump's tough talk on terrorism, neither in the first term nor the second term did he reopen Gitmo to terrorists. It has not happened. Despite him saying all sorts of things on the campaign trail, like we should be killing their families, we should be taking the oil, all the things that he said he was going to do. None of that actually happened. And the war on terror is not really all that different today than it was during the Biden era, than it was during the first Trump term, than it was during the Obama era. It's kind of just ended in this like no man's land of what is possible. But I do think it's kind of just accepted now by our leaders that like Guantanamo was not a good idea, or at least it's not a good idea to continue doing it as anymore. The military tribunals they're just not working. People are trying to make them work, but there have been 9 plea deals and 2 trials. But like generally speaking, like the criminal courts have just been much more successful. So I think we are in some ways as close to a consensus view on this issue as we can be, given how controversial it was. And you're completely right. Like it was so controversial, the idea of bringing terrorists to the United States for trial. And Trump announced he was doing it at the joint address to Congress this year. And nobody said boo. Nobody said a word. It was like, hooray, we caught him. And this guy, Jafar, is awaiting trial. It's the Eastern District of Virginia, which is the one that's all controversial now because Trump fired Eric Siebert, the acting U.S. attorney, because he wouldn't prosecute James Comey, and now it's Lindsay Halligan, this insurance lawyer, is in charge. But like, that's where this is going to take place.
Right. So in some ways, we kind of learned from that time. But one could argue that the war on terror has continued through Hamas's attack on Israel through Islamic extremism. But could we then also then argue that our approach with Israel on that has only then created the same risks of that we incurred during 9/11 of potentially creating more terrorists? Because I do worry that we may be inadvertently creating more spin ghouls for a young kid who lost their family. He's probably 6 years old right now. He lost his entire family, and he's been deeply traumatized. And there's almost nothing you can do to convince him that the United States and the American people are bad. And he's hellbound on getting his revenge. It just takes one crazy person to do that.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is always the debate. I was having to remind people we were listening to Secretary of War Hegseth's speech earlier this week, and he was talking about the rules of engagement, the ROE, and how it can no longer be politically correct or some such construct. And in my first book, in the Outpost, there's when General McChrystal comes and takes over in Afghanistan, he changes the rules of engagement because he is worried that Americans are creating more terrorists than they're killing by being too loose in who they kill, with too many innocent people accidentally killed. And look, I mean, if you're a soldier, so at Cop Keating, which is like a fishbowl, right? It's at the bottom of 3 steep mountains, and people are taking pot shots at you from the mountains, and you look up and you see somebody, but you don't know if it's an enemy combatant. The idea that McChrystal has changed it, saying you have to verify that person has a gun or has a radio or something, that he is definitively an enemy combatant and not just a body up there. That was controversial at the time. And I think that same question, you remember when President Biden went to Israel after October 7th, 2023, and basically warned the Israelis to not do what America did after 9/11. I'm paraphrasing, but don't let your response be driven by your hate. Again, I'm paraphrasing. I mean, that was, I think, I still think about that to this day. And I don't know how this war ends or where this war ends. And I think there are lots of questions about how it's being prosecuted by Netanyahu and what the motivations are. And the idea of defeating every Hamas operative in Gaza is one of these things that we were all debating back in 2001, or you guys are young, so I don't know. But I was watching people debate it in 2001, 2002, which is how do you defeat an idea militarily?
Right.
You can't end Islamist extremism. You can't shoot your way out of it. Right.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. I mean, I think this has been going on now for so many centuries.
Oh, centuries, really. Yeah, exactly. And this comes back to the first question about desperation. And so Spin Ghoul, in my book, Spin Ghoul is no American ever did anything to Spin Ghoul. Spin Ghoul his parents were from Niger. He basically was raised in abject poverty in Saudi Arabia. His parents were essentially indentured servants. One of the other interesting things about the story was because his confession was over multi-days, the book has what a lot of these books don't have, which is the life story of this terrorist, how he came to be a terrorist. And his basic story is he's growing up in Saudi Arabia. He has no future. And the Mujahideen in Saudi Arabia are legends in the 90s. This is all pre 9/11. They're legends for what they did to the Soviets in Afghanistan. They're legends for what they did to the Russians in Chechnya. They were the victims, the Muslims were the victims, at least, in the Balkans. And so it wasn't these tales of glory of 9/11 and whatever. It was perceived as a righteous cause, and not just by Muslims in Saudi Arabia, but even the Americans we were arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, right? So that is his origin story, and it wasn't because he had a beef with the West. It was just being raised the way that some kid in Appalachia might be raised to think he could become a baseball player or a football player because because he hears legendary stories about, some guy that made it from Kentucky in the big leagues. Bitcower told me the story that's not in the book, but it's an interesting story, which is because everybody wants to know, why did Spingool confess? Why did he give this story? And there are lots of reasons why. I think one of them, he's a zealot. He's proud of it. 2, he had been in a Libyan prison for like 5 years. So he was, ready to speak and not be tortured. But when Bitcower was at Yale, he interviewed Ron Darling. Ron Darling had been a legendary New York Met baseball player who'd won a World Series in '86, but also had played for Yale and had pitched a no-hitter at Yale. And when Bitcower asked Ron Darling about pitching a no-hitter at Yale, and this is a guy who has World Series rings, right, or has a World Series ring, Ron Darling remembered every little detail about the day that he pitched a no-hitter. And that Spingool reminded Bitcower of that. Here is a guy talking about his best day in his job. Wow. It just turns out his job was being a terrorist.
Jake, that is a wonderful place for us to end. You've generously given us more than half an hour. Your book comes out October 7th?
Yep.
All right. And for our listeners, they can, of course, follow you on X, your show on CNN. Thank you again. This has been tremendous.
This has been great. Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time.